In 1901, Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, came to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire with an offer, a solution to the empire's crushing debt in exchange for Palestine. Sultan Abdul Hamid II, ruler of the last great Islamic empire, Caliph of 300 million Muslims, looked at the offer and said no. "I will not sell even a foot of land," he said. "My people fought for this land with their blood. We will only give it away with our blood." 8 years later, he was gone, dethroned, exiled, sent to live in the house of a stranger in a city he no longer controlled. The men who removed him were not foreign enemies. They were the graduates of his own schools, the officers of his own army, the students he had personally elevated and educated. They called themselves the Young Turks, and they destroyed everything they claimed to be saving. The Ottoman Empire was, at its height, the longest-lasting empire in the post-Roman world. 600 years, 3 continents, 36 sultans, a civilization that stretched from Vienna to the Persian Gulf, from the Crimea to Sudan. By 1876, when Abdul Hamid II came to the throne, that civilization was unraveling. The empire had been called the sick man of Europe for decades. Territory was being lost in every direction, to Russia in the north, to nationalist movements in the Balkans, to European colonial powers in Africa and the Middle East. Abdul Hamid inherited an empire in crisis. What he did next would define the final chapter of one of history's great powers and seal his own fate. He came to the throne in August 1876 after his brother was deposed. He immediately introduced the first Ottoman constitution, an attempt to modernize the empire and hold off foreign intervention. Then, 2 years later, after a disastrous war with Russia, he suspended the constitution, dissolved parliament, and ruled alone for 30 years. He believed only absolute power could hold the empire together. He was probably right. He was definitely wrong about what would happen next. Here is the great paradox of Abdul Hamid II, and the thing that makes his story unlike any other betrayal in this series. Every other ruler we have covered was destroyed by an outsider, or by someone they trusted from outside their own project. Atahualpa by Pizarro, Caesar by a senator, Alexander by men who had served him. Abdul Hamid was destroyed by an idea he himself planted. The same educational institutions the Sultan sponsored proved to be his downfall. The discontented young intellectuals of the empire, trained in the very schools he had built, coalesced into a movement. He built modern military academies to train a new generation of Ottoman officers. He introduced Western science, medicine, law, and political philosophy into the curriculum. He wanted soldiers who could compete with Europe. What he got were revolutionaries who had read Rousseau, Voltaire, and Mill, and could no longer accept absolute rule from a palace. In 1889, a conspiracy emerged in the Military Medical College and spread through the institutions of Istanbul. The conspirators came to call themselves the Committee of Union and Progress, the Young Turks. When the plot was discovered, its leaders fled abroad to Paris, Geneva, and Cairo, where they spent years building a comprehensive case against everything Abdul Hamid had built. In 1901, Theodor Herzl came to Istanbul with a proposition for the Sultan. The Ottoman Empire was drowning in debt. European banks controlled significant portions of its revenue. Herzl offered to solve the debt problem, bring millions in European investment, and settle the empire's finances, in exchange for one thing: a charter allowing Jewish settlement in Palestine. Abdul Hamid's response was immediate and absolute. "I will not sell even a foot of land, because this land does not belong to me. It belongs to my people. My people fought for this land with their blood. We will only give it away with our blood." Herzl returned the following year with a larger offer. The answer did not change. The refusal made powerful enemies. It also made him a hero to 300 million Muslims. But heroes cannot always hold thrones. The empire's debt remained. The revolutionaries kept meeting in exile. And in Salonika, an Ottoman city Abdul Hamid still controlled, a military conspiracy was quietly becoming a revolution. On the night of July 23, 1908, under pressure from the Young Turk military uprising in Macedonia, Abdul Hamid II reinstated the constitution and called for elections. Celebrations erupted across the empire. Muslims and Christians celebrated together in churches and mosques. Crowds in Istanbul shouted liberty, equality, justice. It seemed like reform. It was actually a trap. Abdul Hamid remained on the throne, technically, but the Committee of Union and Progress now controlled the army, the parliament, and the press. The Sultan was a figure in a palace. Power had already moved. In April 1909, Abdul Hamid made one final attempt to reassert himself, supporting a counter-revolution among conservative elements of the army who wanted to restore his authority. The uprising took the capital. The committee assembled an army in Macedonia, marched on Istanbul, and crushed it within days. It was the excuse they had been waiting for. A delegation of 4 men from the parliament arrived at the palace and delivered the news of his dethronement to his face. The Sultan listened. He did not resist. Abdul Hamid II, 34th Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, Caliph of the Islamic world, was deposed on April 27, 1909. They sent him to Salonika, the city where the revolution had been born. The man who had ruled from a palace of 400 rooms was confined to the Alatini Villa, a merchant family's mansion on the edge of the city. Borrowed rooms in a city that had ended him. From exile, first Salonika, then back to Istanbul under house arrest, Abdul Hamid watched the unraveling of the empire he had governed for more than 3 decades. What he watched was catastrophic. The Young Turks, the men who had promised reform, democracy and revival, made a series of decisions that accelerated every crisis he had spent 30 years containing. They entered World War I on the side of Germany. They lost. The Allied powers occupied Istanbul, dismembered the empire's Arab territories, and drew the borders of the modern Middle East without consulting a single person who lived there. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 gave British support to a Jewish homeland in Palestine, the very land Abdul Hamid had refused to give up 16 years earlier. He died in 1918 in Istanbul under house arrest. As the empire he had fought to preserve was being divided by foreign powers in conference rooms in Paris and London, the 3 men who led the Young Turks, Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha and Cemal Pasha, known as the 3 Pashas, became the effective rulers of the Ottoman Empire from 1913 until its collapse. Enver Pasha dreamed of a pan-Turkic empire stretching to Central Asia. He died in 1922, leading a cavalry charge against the Red Army in Tajikistan, alone, on a horse far from everything he had destroyed. Talat Pasha was assassinated in Berlin in 1921 by an Armenian survivor of the massacres the Young Turks had overseen. Cemal Pasha was killed the same year, in Tiflis. The Ottoman Empire was formally abolished in 1922. The Caliphate, the spiritual leadership of the Muslim world that had existed for over 1,000 years, was abolished in 1924. Turkey became a secular republic. The men who removed Abdul Hamid in the name of reform had dismantled everything the empire had been. History has never settled its verdict on Abdul Hamid II. His supporters call him Ulu Hakan, the Great Khan, for holding the empire together against impossible odds. His detractors call him Kızıl Sultan, the Red Sultan, for the blood they hold him responsible for. The truth, as always, is more complicated than either verdict. He was a man who held 600 years of history together with intelligence, paranoia, and iron will. For 33 years, while every force on earth was trying to take it apart. And then, the generation he had educated, trained, and elevated decided they could do it better. They couldn't. He built the schools that produced the men who destroyed the empire. He built the schools to save. There is no darker betrayal in this series than that one. Not a knife in the Senate, not poison in a cup, just a system devouring its own creator. Subscribe. The next empire is already falling. Next episode, the general who liberated a nation and was destroyed by the government he handed power to.